Why the McCanns would sedate the twins on May 3rd if there was a stage event happening?
Well, because it's the best of two evils. The handwritten timelines, which Matt said was written over a day or two, were in fact rehearsal sheets of what who needed to do and when. So imagine the twins waking up during those crucial hours of the play. It would ruin the whole plan.
For 7 years, burnt still under a retired.
On the night of May 3, 2007, 3-year-old Madeleine McCann vanished without a sound, without a struggle, and without a trace. She was sleeping in a small room with her younger twin siblings, Amélie and Sean, in apartment 5A of the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, Portugal. A modest vacation rental nestled in a sleepy coastal town, far from the chaos of London where her parents worked as medical professionals. They were on holiday. A break. A reset. The kind of trip young families take to exhale, to breathe in new air, to let their children run barefoot and sun-kiss through tiled courtyards and splash in shallow swimming pools. That Thursday night felt ordinary. Safe even. There was no storm, no break-in, no screams in the dark. Just a calm ocean breeze and the fading glow of a sunset over the Algarve. Kate and Gerry McCann, Madeleine's parents, had dinner plans, as they did most nights of the trip. They met with friends at the nearby Tapas restaurant, situated just across the pool, within view of the apartment, if you stood in the right spot. It was part of the Ocean Club complex, a casual outdoor venue for relaxed evening meals. Their group, known in the media as the Tapas 7, was made up of other British holidaymakers with children, friends, doctors, couples. All of them familiar with one another. All of them trusting enough to leave their kids asleep in their rooms and check on them periodically. It was, they said later, a kind of rota system. Every 20 to 30 minutes, one parent from each family would get up from the table, walk to their apartment, peek in at the kids, and return. It seemed safe, logical, practical. No baby monitors. No phones. Just trust. But at 10 p.m., Kate got up from the table and walked back to apartment 5A for her check. She noticed immediately that something was wrong. The door to the children's bedroom was open wider than they had left it. A sudden chill ran through her as she stepped inside. The window was open, the shutter raised. A gust of air moved the curtains like silent ghosts. And then, the empty bed. Madeleine was gone. Not asleep. Not hiding. Not under the covers. Not in the wardrobe or the bathroom. She was just gone. The next moments were panic in slow motion. Kate ran back to the Tapas bar, shouting, "They've taken her! Someone's taken Madeleine!" Chaos erupted. Tables were overturned. Guests ran out into the darkness. Staff were alerted. The police were called. Search parties began. Flashlights swept through streets and bushes and alleyways. Doors were knocked on. Windows were peered in. But the child had vanished. By morning, the case was international. Madeleine's photograph, round face, big blue eyes, and a distinctive mark in her right iris, was shared with police, airports, border officials, newspapers. Her image spread like wildfire across Europe. It became an icon of innocence stolen. Her story was front-page news across the UK and much of the world within 24 hours. And what followed was the largest and most expensive missing persons investigation in modern history. Portuguese police launched an immediate inquiry, while British authorities quickly sent support. Hundreds of volunteers joined the search. Sniffer dogs were brought in. Air and sea units scanned every possible escape route. Border controls were tightened. Private investigators were hired. Media vans parked outside the Ocean Club for months. Celebrities issued statements. The Pope met with the McCanns. Billboards went up. Donations poured in. Candlelight vigils were held in cities far from Praia da Luz. The story captivated the world. And for many, it never let go. The McCanns became public figures almost overnight. Desperate parents transformed into media personalities, their grief magnified under a microscope. Some people rallied behind them, hearts aching for a family shattered. Others, more skeptical, began asking uncomfortable questions. Why leave the children alone? Why no babysitter? Why didn't they use a baby monitor? The questions were endless. The media scrutiny intense. And yet, amid the waves of speculation, one thing remained accepted by nearly everyone, from police to press to public. Madeleine disappeared on the night of May 3, 2007. That date became immovable. The point of origin. The night around which every witness statement, every police report, every media narrative was built. But what if it wasn't? What if that cornerstone, May 3rd, wasn't the night Madeleine disappeared? What if the timeline is flawed? What if everything we've been told started one day too late? It's a theory that has quietly haunted the case for years. And now, nearly 2 decades later, a growing number of researchers, investigators, and independent analysts believe the official timeline may not just be incomplete, it may be fundamentally wrong. What if Madeleine was already gone by the time that now infamous dinner at the Tapas restaurant even began? It's an idea that sounds conspiratorial at first glance. It challenges assumptions. It raises uncomfortable implications. But the deeper you dig into the case, the statements, the files, the photographs, the timelines, the more cracks begin to appear. And once you start seeing them, you can't unsee them. Statements from members of the Tapas group changed subtly over time. Details that should have remained consistent. What the children were wearing, who saw Madeleine last, what time they were checked on, began to blur at the edges. Photographs taken earlier in the holiday have no confirmed timestamps. A key image of Gerry and Madeleine by the pool is disputed. The resort's childcare records show inconsistencies in sign-ins. Witnesses recalled hearing nothing that night. No cries, no struggle, no suspicious figures running from the scene. And perhaps most chillingly, no one outside the Tapas group can confirm seeing Madeleine alive after Tuesday, May 1st. That means the last 2 full days before her disappearance, Wednesday, May 2nd, and Thursday, May 3rd, are built entirely on testimony from those closest to her. People with everything to lose. Now, this doesn't mean we leap to conclusions. It doesn't mean we know what happened. But it does mean something deeply unsettling. If Madeleine was already missing before May 3rd, then the entire timeline is a house of cards. Every search, every suspect, every theory built upon it, misguided. Every assumption, invalid. And that opens the door to something darker. Something more orchestrated. A cover-up. Because if the day is wrong, someone knew it was wrong. And someone let it stay that way. The implications are enormous. It means Madeleine could have been gone for 24 hours, or longer, before anyone outside the group realized. It means vital evidence may have been lost during that silent window. It means witnesses who could have helped were never asked the right questions. And it means an entire planet may have been mobilized around a fiction. The Portuguese police, at least in the early stages, did suspect something wasn't right. They noted inconsistencies. They questioned the lack of physical evidence. They even made the McCanns official suspects, arguidos, in September 2007, months after the disappearance. But political pressure mounted. Public support for the family was enormous. And before long, the narrative hardened. This was an abduction. The McCanns were victims. The case moved on. The media followed. The public followed. And the calendar never changed. But that's why this story matters. Because Madeleine McCann is still missing. And if we've been looking in the wrong time frame, if we've been asking what happened on May 3rd instead of asking what might have happened before, then we may have been staring at the answer without seeing it. This is not just about pointing fingers or revisiting old wounds. This is about correcting the record, rebuilding the timeline, re-examining the days that led up to that fateful dinner. Because in the truth, however painful, it's still possible to find answers. In the next chapters, we will retrace every known step, reopen the creche records, analyze the photographs, study the statements, cross-reference timelines, and explore the inconsistencies that have long been dismissed as simple errors or fading memory. Because if the story got the day wrong, then we owe it to Madeleine, not to protect reputations, not to preserve narratives, but to find the truth, even if it changes everything. Former Norwegian military police investigator Bernt Stellander didn't begin with the question that's haunted the world for over a decade. Who took Madeleine McCann? He didn't start there. He didn't comb through photographs of suspicious men. He didn't chase vanishing shadows or decode timelines that had already been massaged into public record. He didn't start by asking who took her. He asked something darker. What if no one did? To Stellander, the night of May 3rd was not the crime scene, it was the stage. A carefully timed performance, complete with panic, alarm, and urgent cries of abduction. A script rehearsed in silence, carried out in public. He believes the real tragedy happened the night before, on May 2nd, and everything that followed was damage control. His argument is chillingly simple. If you remove the assumption of abduction, the rest of the timeline begins to make a different kind of sense. Too much of it feels staged, polished, recited. The checks to the apartment every 20 minutes. The cries of, "They've taken her," shouted before anyone even searched. The raised window, the open shutter, the questions that were never fully answered. Stellander believes what the world saw on May 3rd was a recreation, a desperate attempt to shift the clock back, to freeze time before the unthinkable was discovered. And he found a crack in the narrative, hidden in Kate McCann's own words. In her 2011 memoir Madeleine, Kate writes about May 2nd, not May 3rd, as the moment everything changed. Why would she write that? Stellander asks. Why describe May 2nd with so much emotional weight, if Madeleine disappeared the following night? It's a question that lingers. In her own retelling, Kate says Madeleine was upset that morning, asking her mother why no one had come the previous night when she and Sean had cried. That detail has haunted readers ever since. Madeleine cried out for help, and no one came. And then, by the next evening, she was gone. To Stellander, this was not just a throwaway anecdote, it was a timestamp. A marker of a moment when something already felt wrong. When Madeleine's voice was still present, but her comfort was already breaking down. A child doesn't ask that question casually, and a mother doesn't recall it unless it meant something. If May 2nd was the last full day of Madeleine's life, everything makes a cruel kind of sense. Then there's the photo. The one released to the public, the so-called last photo of Madeleine, smiling at the pool with her father and siblings. It was said to have been taken on the afternoon of May 3rd. But the original file's metadata was missing. No timestamp, no location data. Just a photo that, in isolation, could have been taken on any day of the holiday. Weather reports from May 3rd suggest overcast skies, not the bright sunshine seen in the image. Some believe the photo was actually taken on May 1st. If that's true, then the last known image of Madeleine alive predates the reported disappearance by 2 full days. There are other strange details. Staff at the Ocean Club creche reportedly last recalled seeing Madeleine on May 2nd. No independent witnesses saw her on May 3rd, not at breakfast, not at the pool, not in passing. Only the McCanns and their friends describe her movements that day. From that point on, everything the world believes about May 3rd relies solely on the statements of the group now known as the Top of Seven. Stellander finds that deeply troubling. In any investigation, he says, the moment you realize all your information stems from one closed circle, you must question the source. Were they protecting someone? Each other? Themselves? He's careful not to make accusations. But he does ask this. If Madeleine was already gone on May 2nd, would the group have had the means and motive to cover it up? He believes they did. And he believes that's exactly what happened. The checks to the apartment on May 3rd, he argues, were theater. Performed at intervals, but inconsistently reported. In some versions, doors were opened and children were observed. In others, the checks were merely auditory, listening for silence. In critical moments, details shift. The supposed sighting of a man carrying a child, originally reported at 9:15 p.m., later became 9:30, then closer to 10. Jane Tanner, who made the sighting, initially placed herself at a location inconsistent with the view she claimed to have had. Her statement changed. Others followed suit. Why would so many intelligent people give such hazy, shifting accounts of one of the most important nights of their lives? Stellander suggests the answer is simple. They were remembering a script, not an event. And scripts change. He also notes the strange behavior in the hours after Madeleine's reported disappearance. Kate ran from the apartment screaming, "They've taken her!" before anyone had searched the grounds. Before anyone had checked the garden, the closets, the bathroom. Before even confirming whether Madeleine had simply wandered off. The reaction was immediate and oddly specific. And then there are the cadaver dogs. Brought in months later, they alerted to the scent of death in multiple places. Behind the sofa in apartment 5A, in the McCann's rental car, on Kate's clothing. The dogs had an impeccable track record, trained to detect human decomposition with near-perfect reliability. But no body was ever found. And so the alerts were dismissed. But to Stellander, they were not meaningless. They were evidence of a death, evidence that had to be explained away because it contradicted the abduction narrative. He looks at the bigger picture. A family under pressure, a child gone, a media storm, political involvement at the highest levels. In that environment, he says, truth becomes slippery. People make choices to protect what's left, to salvage reputation, to preserve the illusion of control. In Stellander's view, the Madeleine McCann case was never about a break-in. It was about a breakdown. A moment of tragedy concealed beneath routine. A secret buried under the weight of expectation. He doesn't claim to know exactly what happened, but he's convinced that what the world saw on May 3rd was not the beginning of a mystery, but the continuation of a lie. He traces the timeline again and again. On May 1st, Madeleine was seen by multiple witnesses. On May 2nd, she made that fateful remark about crying. On May 3rd, nothing. No verified sightings. No photos. Just a narrative constructed in retrospect, told by those with everything to lose. And when Kate McCann sat down to write her memoir, it wasn't May 3rd she lingered on, it was May 2nd. The day everything changed. A slip? A clue? Or a confession hidden in plain sight? To Bernd Stellander, it was the only day that mattered. Because if Madeleine died on May 2nd, then the rest of the timeline, the checks, the sightings, the alarms, the shuttered window, was not the story of a missing child. It was the story of what people did after she was already gone. 2 specially trained dogs were brought into the investigation months after Madeleine McCann was reported missing. These weren't ordinary dogs. They were elite, with a proven track record in locating traces of human remains and blood. One was trained specifically to detect the presence of cadaver scent, the chemical signature of human decomposition. The other was trained to alert to human blood, even in microscopic quantities. Their role was clear, to confirm or rule out the presence of death in the places most closely linked to the case. What happened next sent shockwaves through the investigative team. Both dogs gave strong, unmistakable alerts. First inside apartment 5A, behind the living room sofa, then again on pieces of clothing said to belong to Kate McCann. And most disturbingly, inside the trunk of a rental car the McCanns had only acquired 3 weeks after Madeleine was reported missing. That car, rented in late May, was not part of the initial crime scene. It wasn't connected to the apartment. It wasn't even in the picture during the first weeks of the search. And yet, when the dogs were introduced to the vehicle, their reaction was immediate. The cadaver dog froze and barked. The blood dog followed suit. Both indicated, separately and with precision, that the car had, at some point, carried the scent of death. Critics were quick to downplay the findings. They argued that dog alerts, without corroborating physical evidence, were inconclusive, that there were no visible signs of decomposition. No body, no DNA evidence strong enough to stand on its own. The dogs, they said, could have been confused, contaminated, overreacting to old food, dirty laundry, or trash. But to Bernd Stellander, the alerts were neither vague nor dismissible. He had worked cases involving scent detection dogs. He knew their discipline, their consistency, their unemotional precision. He'd seen firsthand how they ignored distraction, ignored noise, ignored misdirection, and went straight to the truth. Dogs don't lie, Stellander said plainly. People do. He pointed to the dogs' prior success rates, cases where they had located human remains buried deep underground, under concrete, even underwater. These weren't animals chasing smells. They were trained instruments, conditioned through repetition and reward to respond to one thing only, the unmistakable chemical signals of human death. And that scent, according to the dogs, had been present in the very spaces occupied by the McCanns after Madeleine disappeared. But what troubled Stellander more wasn't just that the dogs had alerted, it was when. Why would there be a cadaver scent in a vehicle rented weeks after Madeleine's disappearance? Why not in the days immediately following the alleged abduction? Why in a car that had no contact with the child at the time of her vanishing? The logic, he said, was cold and brutal. Concealment, not coincidence. You don't get cadaver scent in a trunk unless something, or someone, was there long enough to leave it behind. A fleeting contact wouldn't trigger such a strong alert. The scent has to linger. It has to settle. It must be absorbed into the fibers, the air, the environment. It is not easily transferred. It doesn't move from socks to suitcases by accident. And this wasn't just any scent, it was specific to human decomposition. Stellander believed this was the moment when the original timeline collapsed entirely. If Madeleine died on May 2nd, and if the car was rented weeks later, then the only scenario that explains the dog's alert is one where the child's remains were moved. After the initial investigation, after the media storm, after the public's attention had shifted. To him, the implications were devastating. It meant there was no abduction, no late-night intruder, no stranger watching the window. It meant the child had died earlier, possibly accidentally, and that someone had taken measures to remove and conceal the body long enough for police scrutiny to fade. Then, when it felt safe, when the pressure dipped, the body was moved. And the car? It was just the next step in a plan already in motion. To this day, the alerts remain one of the most hotly debated pieces of evidence in the case. Supporters of the McCanns dismiss them as anomalies. Dog behavior, they argue, can't stand up in court. It can be triggered by the faintest, most harmless trace of scent. It can't prove who died or how. It can't convict. But Stellander never claimed it could. He never suggested the dogs alone could close the case. What he argued, what he still argues, is that the dogs revealed a truth the timeline couldn't account for. A truth that called every other detail into question. And when placed alongside the shifting stories, the missing hours, the altered statements, the emotional distancing in the parents' behavior, those alerts stopped looking like coincidences. They started to look like clues. Because in an investigation full of contradictions and blurred memories, the dogs were the only ones who never changed their story. Kate McCann jogged often during the weeks following her daughter's disappearance. To many, it looked like a coping mechanism. A mother thrust into unimaginable pain, surrounded by media, investigators, and the relentless eyes of a world demanding answers, simply trying to hold herself together. Movement as survival. The rhythm of her footsteps offering something steady in the chaos that swallowed everything else. But as the days turned into weeks, something curious began to emerge. Her jogging route wasn't random. There was one place she kept returning to. A specific spot on the outskirts of Praia da Luz. Not along the usual tourist paths. Not part of any scenic coastal trail. A quiet, dusty hillside, sparse with low brush and uneven rocks. No signage. No benches. No footpath leading to it. It was remote, easy to overlook. And yet she went there. Over and over. Alone. Locals started to notice. Taxi drivers. Groundskeepers. Resort staff. The people who lived in the town, who had watched the Ocean Club transform into the center of an international crisis, began to talk among themselves. About the woman in running clothes. The same hill. The same time of day. No camera crews. No police escort. Just Kate McCann, returning again and again to a stretch of land no one could explain. They gave it a name. Quietly, unofficially. Spot One. To Bernd Stellander, it was a pattern worth watching. A place worth observing. He had learned, through years of military and investigative experience, that people in crisis sometimes return to the source. To the scene. Or, in some cases, to the burial. He began spending time near Spot One. Discreetly. At a distance. Sometimes with binoculars. Sometimes just sitting and watching. No interference. No confrontation. Just eyes and patience. And what he saw unsettled him. Because Kate McCann didn't just jog to that hillside. She stopped there. She lingered. She moved slowly, deliberately. She wasn't stretching. She wasn't resting. She was doing something else. Something private. He saw her kneel once. Saw her hands arranging something on the ground. On another day, she returned and appeared to be adjusting what she had left behind. Then came the twigs. Stellander recalled the moment he saw her place them down. One by one. Not scattered. Not casually dropped. Carefully laid out in the shape of the letter Th. It was unmistakable. A simple formation, but intentional. Precise. An initial, perhaps. The first letter of a name now known around the world. Madeleine. A few days later, he returned to the hillside alone. The twigs were still there. Undisturbed. Not blown by wind. Not kicked aside. Just as she had left them. Next to them, he found small flower petals, arranged in a circular pattern. Local wildflowers, purple and yellow. Nothing extravagant. Nothing store-bought. Just something quiet, thoughtful. Then came the hearts, drawn into the dirt by hand, or perhaps with a stick. 5 of them, side by side. All roughly the same size. Not childlike doodles. Symbols of grief, repeated with care. She never spoke of these visits publicly. Never mentioned Spot 1 in interviews, in her book, or during press conferences. But Stellander kept watching. She returned again and again. Sometimes at sunrise. Sometimes closer to dusk. She never brought anyone with her. Not her husband. Not friends. Not family. Always alone. Always with the same pace, the same quiet. He never saw her dig. Never saw her carry a bag or tool. But he also never saw her act aimlessly. There was focus in her movements. Meaning. A ritualistic repetition that couldn't be explained by chance. These were not the actions of someone just jogging. They were the behaviors of someone visiting something, or someone, that mattered. To Stellander, it looked like mourning. Not panic. Not the raw, frantic kind that dominates the hours and days after a child goes missing. But a different kind. Quieter. Older. Private. The kind that comes when the grief is already known. Spot 1 didn't look like a place of hope. It looked like a place of memory. A place of returning. A place of confession. He watched her once as she stood perfectly still for nearly 15 minutes, her head bowed, her hands clasped. He couldn't hear if she was speaking, but the silence around her seemed heavy, thick, sacred. He noted the details, the routine, the body language. He mapped her route, tracked the time of day. Sometimes she stayed for 10 minutes, other times for longer. There were gaps, days when she didn't return. But then she would come again. Always back to the same hill. Always alone. Stellander had no evidence to call it a burial site. No proof. No photographs of anything being hidden or removed. And yet, what he saw weighed on him far more heavily than any police report or contradictory statement. Because it wasn't what Kate McCann said, it was what she did. Over and over again. He remembered the military principle, trauma anchors to places. People return to the scene, not always consciously. Some to relive. Some to grieve. Some to hide. He began to see Spot 1 not just as a hill, but as a symbol. A sacred space. A place that held more than silence. A place where guilt might sit quietly beneath memory. Or where love, still unspoken, returned in the form of flowers, twigs, and dirt-drawn hearts. He knew what it looked like from afar. A grieving mother, lost in ritual. But he also knew what it looked like up close. Someone keeping vigil. Someone preserving a secret in a place no one else thought to search. Not because of fear, but because of knowing. He never confronted her. Never asked. He kept his distance. Kept his notes. But to this day, he calls that hill the single most haunting place connected to the case. Not the apartment. Not the car. Not the Tapas restaurant. That hill. Because while the world searched for clues in airports and across borders, Stellander believed the most important question wasn't how far Madeleine might have been taken. It was how close she might have stayed. He believes these weren't just coping mechanisms. They weren't daily rituals meant to pass the time or soothe a restless body under stress. These were private acts of grief, quietly executed far away from the lens of the media and the noise of public scrutiny. Not declarations of hope, but quiet admissions of loss. They were unspoken memorials, perhaps never meant to be seen. Each visit to that secluded hill, each arrangement of twigs, each hand-drawn heart in the dust, whispered a language beyond interviews and press conferences. It was the kind of grief that hides in repetition, that mourns not in headlines but in patterns. She was not jogging for distraction. She was returning, again and again, with the devotion of someone who believed there was something to return to. But there was someone missing from that picture. Gerry McCann never joined her. Never once, in all the days Stellander watched that hill, did he see Gerry beside her. Not at sunrise. Not at dusk. Not in the lonely silence of those carefully placed petals or in the kneeling silhouette of a mother who had made that space her sanctuary. Gerry was always somewhere else. At meetings. At press conferences. Speaking with politicians. Attending interviews. Always positioned publicly. Always engaged with the campaign. But never at Spot One. Never at the Hill. To Stellander, that absence was not neutral. It was glaring. He didn't see it as a logistical oversight or a division of roles between grieving parents. He saw it as something deeper, more psychologically rooted, a kind of silent wall, erected not just between the McCanns and the world, but between the McCanns and each other. He calls it emotional compartmentalization, the psychological act of splitting internal experiences, of separating what is felt from what is shown, of living two truths, one buried, one displayed. And in this case, he believes that split may have been necessary to maintain the official story. Kate, raw and visibly anguished, let her grief leak into her solitude. In those quiet moments, in the shadow of that empty hill, she gave it shape, laid it down like an offering, performed rituals that suggested closure, of a kind no public statement could allow. She mourned not as a mother of a missing child, but as a mother of one she already knew was gone. Gerry, on the other hand, remained composed, purposeful. He was the strategist, the organizer, the force behind the fundraising, the political lobbying, the structured PR. He didn't grieve in public. He didn't break down. His pain, if it existed, was not shared in gestures, not made visible on hillsides. It was held back, managed, tucked into a version of himself that could navigate interviews and sit with government officials and never falter in his message. Madeleine is alive, and we must find her. To many, that discipline was admirable. A father refusing to give in. A man determined to find his daughter. But to Stellander, that relentless forward posture raised a different question. What was being held back to preserve that image? He'd seen it before. In soldiers, in police officers, in families shielding secrets. That ability to partition emotion, to wall off the unbearable and carry on. It wasn't strength. It was survival. And sometimes it was protection. Because if one person in a relationship has processed grief, and the other is pretending it hasn't happened, there's a rift. A fracture beneath the surface. And if that fracture grows deep enough, it becomes something else. Complicity, denial, or quiet knowledge. Stellander never saw Gerry McCann perform a single act of private grief. No silent vigils. No flowers. No letters. No walks back to the apartment. No candlelit prayers. What he saw was performance, not ritual. Messaging, not mourning. And to him, the contrast was too great to ignore. It's not, he says, that Gerry McCann didn't love his daughter. It's not even that he didn't feel pain. But pain, Stellander argues, comes in many forms. And when that pain is buried beneath the weight of a secret, especially one as unthinkable as the accidental death or concealment of a child, it no longer expresses itself in tears. It hardens. It organizes. It mobilizes. It becomes purpose. He recalls watching Kate, hunched over at Spot One, smoothing the soil with the back of her hand. Like a mother brushing the hair of a child long gone. He watched her make the same motions, the same gestures, with no camera watching, no one to impress. It wasn't for anyone. It was for Madeleine, or for the memory of her. Then he'd see Gerry, that same day, standing before microphones, calling for more donations, shaking hands with dignitaries, appealing for continued hope. To the world, it looked like a team, each doing their part. But Stellander didn't see two halves of the same strategy. He saw two realities, two different understandings of the same event. One rooted in silent grief, the other in controlled narrative. That's what emotional compartmentalization does. It lets you live two truths without ever reconciling them. It lets you stand before the world and speak of hope while privately believing there's nothing left to find. It lets one parent return, again and again, to the place they can't leave behind, while the other walks away and never looks back. And for Bernd Stellander, that gap is not just emotional. It's evidential. Because in criminal investigations, absence often says more than presence. And the absence of Gerry McCann from Spot 1, from Kate's private rituals, from any visible act of personal grief, was louder than any speech he gave. For over 5 years, Bernd Stellander says he tracked the comings and goings at that hillside, Spot 1, as it came to be known in his private files. He didn't advertise what he was doing. He didn't call the press or leak his findings to tabloids. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was chasing a pattern, a quiet one that never shouted but whispered consistently, persistently, into the silence left behind after the world turned its attention elsewhere. The McCann case had gone global. There were front pages, vigils, documentaries, denials, and debates. But long after the noise faded, Stellander kept returning to the same stretch of lonely, wind-blown land above Praia da Luz. And every time, he brought the same tools: a camera with a long-range lens, a waterproof notebook, a pencil dulled from daily use. He never wore a badge, never identified himself. Just a man in neutral clothing, walking carefully, often well before sunrise or as the last light dipped behind the Algarve cliffs. He says what he found, again and again, were signs of presence. Evidence not of a crime scene, but of a grieving routine. Something private. Something ritualistic. Items that didn't belong to nature and didn't blow there by chance. There were weather-worn symbols, hearts etched into the dirt with sticks, some barely visible, some recent enough that the soil was still loose. There were candle stubs, wax melted and cooled, sometimes sun-bleached, sometimes half-buried by wind. Not the kind used for light, but the kind used for memory. Memorial candles. Tiny vigil flames extinguished by time. He documented each one. Took wide shots. Close-ups. Measured the patterns when he could. If a new arrangement appeared, stones in a circle, petals from a nearby plant bent carefully into a crescent, he'd note its position, direction, and estimated age based on weather patterns. Once, he found a string of beads, children's plastic, pink and purple, threaded around a stick jammed gently into the earth. Another time, a single child's sock. Folded. Weighted with a pebble. He left everything untouched. That was his first rule. No interference. He wasn't there to change anything. He was there to see. And what he saw, over time, was a pattern that felt intentional. These weren't random acts of nature or litter dropped by wandering hikers. This hillside was not a tourist destination. It had no path, no markings, no benches. There were no signs that people picnicked here, no Instagram geotags. The only consistent footprints belonged to one person, or maybe two at most, returning, carefully, and not always frequently, but always on their own schedule, always in silence. Sometimes weeks would pass with no change. Then suddenly, something new would appear. A small cross made of twigs, a feather tied with a ribbon, a half-buried piece of paper, water-damaged and torn beyond recognition, but clearly once folded. Another time, he spotted a rock that had been painted, just one corner, with a faint smear of yellow. He began to correlate the visits with calendar dates. Madeleine's birthday, the anniversary of her disappearance, the week her parents returned from London for brief visits. Even media events, when new documentaries aired or when international interest briefly reignited, Spot 1 would respond, not loudly but gently. A fresh flower, a rearranged twig formation. Once, a tiny M traced in the soil, slightly uneven, but unmistakable. To Stellander, this wasn't superstition. This was behavior, the kind rooted in psychological need, in guilt, in longing, in the unbearable weight of memory, the kind of behavior that doesn't advertise itself, but must express itself somewhere. He noted who didn't appear there. No tourists, no photographers, no joggers aside from the woman he had first observed, no family groups, no curious locals, just the occasional solitary figure, usually hooded or with a cap pulled low, arriving with something in their hand and leaving empty-handed. Sometimes he caught them in frame, far in the distance, silhouetted against the scrubland. He never approached, never confronted. He respected the silence. But he noted the dates, times, and posture. One figure, he believed, was Kate McCann. The build, the stride, the presence matched what he had recorded before. She never lingered long. 10 minutes, 15 at most. But each time, she left something. Each time, she returned. And sometimes, not always, but just enough to notice, the visits would cluster closely after media scrutiny, after new pressure. Almost as if someone needed to reconnect, to reaffirm, to release. Stellander kept it all to himself. Not out of fear, but out of focus. He believed Spot 1 wasn't a place that would yield confessions or physical evidence. It was something more delicate. It was the subconscious speaking through routine. It was ritual, pure, raw, unfiltered. And for someone like him, trained to observe people under pressure, to spot patterns in silence, it was louder than any interview could ever be. He started referring to the items left behind as signals. Not in the conspiratorial sense, but in the emotional one. These were expressions of feeling that had nowhere else to go. They weren't proof of a crime, but they were proof of something unresolved. Something trapped in time. And so, for 5 years, he documented everything. Folded petals, fragments of ribbon, twigs shaped like initials. He logged weather patterns to see how long items had remained, compared satellite images over time to confirm undisturbed ground, cataloged over 130 photos, wrote more than 200 pages of field notes, all on a hill with no official relevance to the investigation. He never presented it to police. Not yet. He believed they wouldn't know what to do with it. These weren't fingerprints or blood samples. But to him, they were emotional artifacts. They were the closest anyone had come to truth in a case built on fog. Because while the official timelines scattered across statements and public narratives split into theories, Spot 1 remained constant. It didn't change with media pressure. It didn't contradict itself. It simply received, silently, over and over again. And Stellander kept watching. Not because he expected a breakthrough, but because he knew grief always leaves footprints. Even in the places no one else is looking. Stellander's theory is not just about when Madeleine McCann died. It's about something deeper, more unsettling. Not just the timeline, but the geography of grief. The location of memory. The place where loss was not just acknowledged internally but mourned in physical space. In his view, the timeline was manipulated, yes, rehearsed, reconstructed to deflect attention from an earlier tragedy. But what the timeline can't hide, what human instinct reveals despite itself, is where someone returns when they believe no one is watching. And for 5 years, Stellander watched. Spot 1. A bare hillside outside the village. No path, no sign, no tourism, no tactical value. But it kept calling someone back. Again and again. Quietly. Deliberately. With gestures that, to the untrained eye, might seem harmless. The flower. A stick. A pressed shape in the dirt. But to Stellander, those gestures were everything. Because they weren't made in public. They weren't performative. They were private. Consistent. Emotionally charged. This wasn't a mother visiting every church. This wasn't a father placing yellow ribbons in every town square. This wasn't public advocacy. This was private ritual. A return. A repetition. A silent message, left not for the world, but for the one who was lost. And perhaps, Stellander believes, for the one who was buried. Because that's the core of his theory. That Spot 1 is not just a place of mourning. It may be a place of concealment. He doesn't say it lightly. He knows the implications. He knows what it means to suggest that a body may have been hidden there, that someone may have chosen that lonely hill not just for its silence, but for what it could swallow. That while search teams combed beaches and scanned ports and chased shadows through the streets of Praia da Luz, the truth may have been sitting under the sun, in plain sight, marked not with evidence bags but with small hearts drawn into the soil by a grieving hand. For all the sophisticated technology deployed in the McCann case, international databases, border alerts, surveillance footage, linguistic analysis, psychological profiling, no forensic team has ever excavated Spot 1. No ground-penetrating radar. No cadaver dogs. No thermal scans. Not a single spade of earth lifted. It has remained untouched. A blind spot. A void in the map. And no one, not the parents, not the investigators, not the private detectives or the journalists, has explained the repeated, ritualistic visits to that hill. Not once. Not in public statements. Not in memoirs. Not in court filings. No one has acknowledged it, let alone accounted for it. But why does a place that seems to hold so much emotional gravity remain invisible in the official record? To Stellander, the answer is painfully simple. Because you don't return to a place over and over unless it means something. Unless it anchors something inside you that cannot be spoken aloud. And if that place holds significance that contradicts the official story, if it contradicts the timeline, the narrative of a stranger's abduction, the idea that Madeleine simply vanished into the night, then acknowledging that place becomes dangerous. Because it becomes the one place the story doesn't want us to look. But Stellander looked. He looked for years. Not once. Not out of morbid curiosity. But systematically. As a trained observer. As someone who knew what to look for when people grieve not in public but in secret. He documented changes to the hill, tracked soil disturbances, took photos of newly left items and noted when they were removed or altered. He wasn't guessing, he was studying, and what he saw over and over again was consistency, emotional logic, human behavior following predictable pathways, a grief not scattered, but focused, localized, like a compass pointing to the same true north no matter how the story spun. Spot 1 never changed. What changed was the world around it. Public interest waned. Police rotations came and went. Theories shifted. Suspects emerged and disappeared. But the hill remained. And someone kept returning. Even after the case cooled. Even after it became old news. Even when the world stopped searching, someone still walked that dusty slope, laid something down, and left again in silence. That's not nothing. That's everything. And so Stellander asks the question no one else wants to put on record. What if Madeleine McCann never left Praia da Luz? What if she died on May 2nd, not May 3rd? What if the morning of May 3rd was the beginning of a performance, not a tragedy? And what if, instead of vanishing without a trace, she was taken, quietly, sorrowfully, to a place that someone knew well, where she could be mourned, remembered, visited, and ultimately hidden? That hill. That unremarkable patch of land. Spot 1. Untouched by authorities. Absent from the case file. Never acknowledged in official interviews. But it's there. And Stellander believes it may be the one place where truth was never spoken, but always present. Bernd Stellander's central arguments challenge everything the public has been told. He doesn't just raise questions, he rewrites the sequence of events entirely. To him, the accepted timeline isn't flawed. It's constructed, engineered, a carefully layered performance built to hide a far more difficult truth. His theory doesn't begin with what the McCanns said or what was reported by the press. It begins with what didn't add up. The silences, the absences, the rituals no one could explain. And from those gaps, he rebuilt a sequence that radically reinterprets the most scrutinized missing persons case of the 21st century. First, he argues that Madeleine McCann died on the night of May 2nd, not May 3rd. This alone would change everything. Because May 2nd isn't the date emblazoned across missing posters and global headlines. It's not the night police were called. It's not the night the McCanns say they found the bed empty and the window open. It's the night before all of that. A night almost entirely undocumented in the investigation. No frantic phone calls. No media frenzy. No press conference. Just a regular evening on holiday, on the surface. But Stellander doesn't believe that night was ordinary. He believes something irreversible happened on May 2nd. Something catastrophic. Something final. And everything that followed, the check-ins, the dinner with friends, the panic on May 3rd, was built to create a controlled explosion. A scripted narrative that would ignite attention, but only in a specific direction, away from what happened the night before. According to Stellander, the panic on May 3rd was staged. Not fabricated in the sense of being emotionless. He doesn't argue that no one was afraid, but rather that the fear was no longer about Madeleine's safety. It was fear of discovery. Fear of what an investigation too close to the truth might uncover. The timeline had to be reshaped. The story had to be unified. And everyone, friends, staff, law enforcement, had to be steered toward that singular narrative. And so the evening of May 3rd unfolded with precision. There were check-ins and movements. Tapa's bar conversations. A sudden scream. A search. A report to the police at exactly the right moment. Statements were aligned. Gaps were filled. Explanations rehearsed. People were assigned roles. Some were likely unaware they were even playing a part. They were just reacting to what they were told. But at the core of it, Stellander believes, was an orchestrated decision to create a new origin point for Madeleine's disappearance, one that placed it far enough from the truth to make investigation almost impossible. Because if she died on May 2nd, the entire police response on May 3rd was misplaced from the very beginning. Every door knocked on, every car stopped, every flight checked, every report filed. That entire wave of urgency was aimed at a vanishing point that didn't exist. It wasn't just misdirection. It was the reconstruction of reality. And for Stellander, the weight of that deception lies not only in what was said, but in what was done in the days and weeks that followed. The behavior, the emotional inconsistencies, the ritualistic visits to Spot One, the body language, the rehearsed appeals, the absence of true grief in certain places, the excess of it in others. He doesn't point fingers with cruelty. He doesn't accuse without analysis. But his reconstruction is clear. 1. Madeleine died on May 2nd. The real night of tragedy, quiet, devastating, and unrecorded, was hidden under a layer of choreography that began the moment someone realized there was no turning back. 2. The panic on May 3rd was staged. Not fabricated from nothing, but shaped deliberately to unify witness testimony, police assumptions, and press coverage under one simple, powerful idea. She was taken tonight. A lie, Stellander believes, powerful enough to redirect the entire course of the investigation. And one that may have worked. 3. The cadaver scent in the McCann's rental car was not, in Stellander's view, a case of cross-contamination or a misleading trace. It wasn't the scent of someone who had touched a body bag or been near a place of death. It was the unmistakable signature of human decomposition. Trained dogs, a blood detection dog and a cadaver dog, both gave positive alerts. Not once, but multiple times. Inside the apartment, behind the sofa, in the garden. And weeks later, in a vehicle the McCanns had rented after Madeleine was reported missing. To the critics, these alerts weren't conclusive. They pointed to the absence of physical remains, the lack of DNA certainties. They suggested that the dogs could have been confused, that scent might have transferred on items of clothing or possessions. But to Stellander, these arguments miss the point. Dogs don't lie. People do, he said bluntly. And in his assessment, the dogs told a story the evidence couldn't, that a body had been hidden, that a body had been moved, and most crucially, that the McCanns had access to that body weeks after the reported abduction. You don't move a child's body weeks after a disappearance unless you're trying to hide something deeper than tragedy. That, in Stellander's view, is not misfortune. It's concealment. For Kate's repeated visits to Spot One, the secluded hillside outside Praia da Luz, are not, Stellander believes, simple acts of reflection or therapeutic exercise. They are rituals. Emotional rituals. And in trauma psychology, rituals matter. They speak to unresolved grief, to mourning without resolution, to a private truth that cannot be spoken aloud. The arrangements she made there, twigs in the shape of a nymph, hearts scratched into the dirt, wilted flowers placed with care, were not random gestures. They were precise, repetitive. They were not acts of hope. They were acts of farewell. Perhaps not guilt in the criminal sense, but guilt of the emotional kind. The guilt of knowing something and carrying it alone. Of mourning in secret while maintaining a public image of optimism and strength. She never talked about Spot One. Never mentioned it in interviews. Never acknowledged the visits. But they happened. And they happened with frequency. And that silence, Stellander believes, says more than any press release ever could. It was a private graveyard of emotion. A confessional with no priest. A place where the truth may have echoed, again and again, in footsteps and soil rather than words. 5. Gerry's behavioral detachment, according to Stellander, is not the posture of a man in denial. It's the armor of a man practicing psychological self-protection. Detachment doesn't mean innocence. Sometimes, it means something far more dangerous. A compartmentalization so thorough it becomes indistinguishable from conviction. Gerry was composed. Controlled. He steered the press. Managed the campaign. Negotiated with political figures. He led with purpose. But he did not break. He did not weep publicly. He did not return to the hill. He did not kneel in the dirt. And for Stellander, this isn't strength. It's distance. It's evidence, not of guilt per se, but of division. Of an internal split so clean, so functional, it allowed him to perform a role that no grieving parent could truly sustain without breaking. He didn't join the rituals. Didn't visit Spot One. Didn't grieve in the places where Kate seemed anchored. And that absence, Stellander says, is a statement in itself. In criminal profiling, absence is never neutral. It's data. To Stellander, Gerry's missing emotional presence in the landmarks of loss, those sacred spaces of private mourning, suggests not ignorance, but insulation. A psychological firewall built not just to protect himself from pain, but possibly from the truth. And when combined, these 5 points form the foundation of Stellander's shadow timeline. A theory not of stranger abduction, but of something closer. Something quieter. Something more devastating. That Madeleine McCann's death was real. That it occurred earlier than the world was told. That it was covered, buried beneath performance. That it left traces. In cars. In soil. In behavior. In silence. And in the end, those traces, however faint, still speak. If Bernd Stellander is right, if his years of quiet observation, his reconstructed timelines, and his forensic logic hold even a fraction of truth, then what the world witnessed wasn't just a desperate search for a missing child. It was something far more devastating. One of the most televised, dissected, and politicized child abduction cases in modern history may have never been an abduction at all. It may have been the aftermath of a domestic tragedy, an accident, a medical emergency, or an unforeseen event that turned fatal. And what followed was not a whodunit, but a what now? Not a mystery, but a decision. A decision to reshape time. To recast events. To tell the world it all began on May 3rd, when Stellander believes it ended the night before. A decision to focus the public's eyes outward, on suspects, shadows, and strangers, while the real heartbreak remained buried in silence. If Stellander is right, then the global campaign, the media fury, the posters, the press conferences, all of it was built to protect not just a secret, but a family from ruin. A choice made in panic, sustained by pressure, and locked in place by the sheer weight of global attention. If he's right, then Spot One may be more than a shrine. It may be the unspoken epicenter of it all. A place where mourning was real. Where ritual replaced confession. Where one parent returned in grief, and the other stayed away in fear or denial. A place untouched by forensic tools, by investigators, by cadaver dogs. A place that received what the world never did, the truth. But if Stellander is wrong, if his analysis has followed false patterns, if his years of field notes and unspoken theories have mistaken ritual for coincidence, absence for calculation, then the consequences are painful in another way. Because in that scenario, his work has only deepened the suffering of a family already fractured by the unimaginable. A mother and father who lost their daughter, then had their motives, emotions, and actions dissected not just by media and police, but by former officers watching from a hillside with a notebook. If Stellander is wrong, he spent years casting a shadow over grieving parents, interpreting silence as strategy and sorrow as guilt. If he's wrong, then the rituals he documented were not signs of concealment, but of a mother desperately holding on to a connection she refuses to let go of. Then Gerry's detachment isn't evidence, it's how he survives. And the cadaver dog alerts? Tragic anomalies. Unexplainable but inconclusive. Another layer of confusion in a case defined by it. If he's wrong, then Spot 1 is not a burial site or a secret grave. It's simply a place of memory. A silent space where a mother returned not to hide, but to feel. To do the only thing she could when the rest of the world demanded strength, press releases, and composure, to grieve. And that's the tension at the heart of this case. Because truth, in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, has always lived in the shadows. Between timelines. Between statements. Between public performance and private behavior. Bernd Stellander tried to peer into that space. Not as a prosecutor. Not as a headline hunter. But as a man trained to listen when no one else does. Whether he's right, or tragically, irrevocably wrong, his theory forces us to look again. Not at the headlines, but at what was left behind. The current official investigation, after years of shifting leads and dead ends, now points toward a different suspect entirely, Christian Bruckner, a convicted sex offender with a history of violence, abuse, and a presence in Praia da Luz at the time of Madeleine's disappearance. His criminal profile fits the story we've been told. A predator lurking on the fringes, capable of taking a child and disappearing without a trace. The perfect villain for a mystery that needs closure. But Stellander isn't convinced. Because for all the headlines and renewed urgency that surrounded Bruckner's naming, the facts remain as thin as ever. There have been no charges, no trial, no confession, and most crucially, no body. Years after Bruckner became the centerpiece of renewed investigation efforts, the case against him still hinges on circumstantial evidence, cell tower data, vague witness recollections, and the proximity of his camper van. Enough to raise suspicion, but not enough to bring justice. And that's what Stellander returns to again and again. The absence. The emptiness where truth should be. The way the investigation always seems to reset itself, shifting from one theory to the next, from sketches to EFIDs, from Eastern European gangs to lone predators to distant German ex-cons. All the while, the core inconsistencies, the gaps in the timeline, the behavioral anomalies, the unsearched hillside, are left untouched. Stellander doesn't claim certainty. He's not a prosecutor, not a judge. He's not trying to convict the McCanns or exonerate anyone else. What he offers is doubt. Uncomfortable, persistent doubt. The kind that doesn't fade with headlines. The kind that lingers when you notice the same footprints appearing on the same hill year after year. The kind that grows louder the longer no definitive answer is found. And in cases like this, doubt is a heavy weight. It drags behind every new theory. It clouds every official statement. It lives in the silence between what we're told and what we see. And for families, investigators, and those watching from the sidelines, that doubt is as corrosive as certainty is liberating. Because when a child disappears and no truth rises to the surface, only two things remain. A public still searching, and a private grief that never lets go. Madeleine McCann was just 3 years old. A child on holiday with her family, days filled with sun, warm air, and laughter, until one evening changed everything. She was small. She was vulnerable. She was full of potential. And then she was gone. What followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen for a missing child. Her image wasn't just shared, it was broadcasted. Her name didn't fade, it echoed. The photo of her in the pink hat, her bright eye and small gap-toothed smile, became etched into the public consciousness. She became a symbol. A child lost, not in the shadows of war or poverty, but in the heart of a European resort. Her face appeared on posters, newsstands, airports, storefronts. Her name trended across continents. Presidents were briefed. Celebrities made appeals. Millions were spent. Billions of people knew her name. And still, her fate remains unknown. Not one definitive answer. Not one solid conclusion. Years of investigation, thousands of tips, hundreds of interviews, and no clear resolution. Madeleine became more than a child. She became a question no one could answer. She became a mystery that grew with each passing year. A life interrupted. A case that became a mirror to our fear, our suspicion, our willingness to believe, or to look away. Bernd Stellander's theory does not promise closure. It doesn't offer a final chapter. It offers doubt. Not to be cruel, not to sensationalize, but because in his mind, the official story didn't hold under the weight of observation. And so he asked a dangerous question: what if we've been looking at this the wrong way? What if the night of May 3rd, the night etched into every article, every statement, every anniversary vigil, wasn't the night Madeleine disappeared? What if the timeline, so carefully constructed and reinforced, wasn't a record of events, but a script? What if it was a performance? Not out of malice, but out of desperation, out of shock, out of fear. If you believe Stellander, then that night, the 3rd, was the world's entry point to a story that had already ended. And everything that followed, the friends' statements, the media frenzy, the police response, was a reaction to a carefully curated reality. And if that's true, then what truth was buried beneath it? Was it an accident no one could face? A tragedy masked by panic? A moment that could destroy lives, reputations, families. So it was hidden behind the power of narrative? Because if a child died on May 2nd, and the world was told she vanished on May 3rd, then the true moment of heartbreak didn't go uninvestigated. It went unacknowledged. And somewhere in that blind spot, the answers may have always been waiting. But let's ask the inverse. Let's suppose Stellander is wrong. Let's say the McCanns were exactly what they seemed, devastated parents trapped in an unthinkable nightmare, fighting to stay afloat in a tidal wave of judgment and attention. Then his theory, however careful, however methodical, has cast another shadow over their grief. It has dissected rituals that might simply be sorrow. It has interpreted silence as strategy, detachment as design. And if that's the case, the tragedy only deepens. Because Madeleine is still gone. And the pain her family endures is not eased by theories or timelines or shadows on a hillside. It is constant. It is cruel. It is real. But whether you believe Stellander's theory or reject it completely, whether you see Spot 1 as a place of concealment or a place of mourning, there is one question that refuses to die. If the timeline was a performance, what truth was buried beneath it? Who knew it? Who saw it? Who helped shape it? And if someone out there, anyone, knows what really happened, knows what didn't get said, knows what didn't fit neatly into statements or schedules or press conferences, this is your moment to speak. Before silence becomes permanent. Before memories fade. Before we rewrite history so many times that we forget what was ever true. Because behind the noise, the theories, the documentaries, the lawsuits, the headlines, there was a little girl named Madeleine. She had a favorite toy. She liked bedtime stories. She had a laugh, a voice, a heartbeat. And she vanished. Not just from the apartment in Praia de Luz, but from the world. If you know what happened, no matter how small, no matter how long you've kept it, no matter what you were told to believe, it's not too late. Say something. Because the world can debate timelines forever. It can argue about cadaver dogs and suspect profiles and psychological motives. But none of that will bring Madeleine home. Only truth will. And truth, no matter how long it's buried, still breathes beneath the silence.